Welcome back to the Our View podcast. On today's episode, I welcome my guest, Alyson Patsavas. Alyson is a professor at the University of Illinois and is a film producer and writer. She and I discuss the representation of people with disabilities in film and how it can have an impact on society and their beliefs and stereotypes about those who have disabilities. I would like to welcome everyone back to another episode of the Our View podcast, where we aim to educate, raise awareness, and change the tone of conversation about disabilities. I'm very happy to welcome my guest on today's show, Alyson Patsavas, and I am so excited to hear you, have you here with us all, and to talk about disabilities and the movies. Movies are a thing that most people enjoy, I think, and they've become very easily available to us lately with all of the Netflix and Amazon and HBO Max streaming services. So I'm really excited for our conversation today, and welcome to the podcast.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So I'd like to start off my podcast with asking my guests to introduce themselves. So can you tell us who is Alyson?
Yeah, I am a funny. That's maybe we could start actually by saying I'm used to people calling me Allie. So
Okay.
I'm a little tripped up by by the Alyson. I was like, wait, who is Alyson? I don't know. So I go by Allie, Allie Patsavas. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Disability and Human Development at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I am just turned 39, and I have spent by now the majority of my life as a disabled person. That's a funny thing to realize when you have sort of passed the midway point. But I acquired my disability in my teenage years, and so really sort of lived a lot of my life not connected to disability community, but arrived at it through academic work, actually. And so for me, academics and disability activism and disability community are all sort of deeply tied together. And in a lot of ways, that is sort of the story of how I came to be interested in disability in film as well.
Yeah.
So somewhat circuitous answer, I suppose.
I always like asking that question because the answers are always so different from everyone. So I appreciate that. And so Allie, I will I will respect
Sorry,
her.
I'm so sorry. I should have said.
No, that's fine. That's fine because I always get asked, well, do you go by Art? Do you go by Arthur? And it's a weird thing because my dad, I was named after my dad, so I was always Arthur. He was always Art. But as I got older, my dad passed away when I was 17. But as I got older, people in my family and friends, they start calling me Art, and it just, I answer to both. You know, unless when my mom calls me Arthur, that's when I get nervous, like, oh no, what did I do?
Yeah, this is why I sort of balked at
Right.
who is Alyson.
So, Allie, you briefly mentioned how you got interested in topics related to disabilities. Can you go into a little bit more about that, and especially in the film industry, how you became interested in that?
Yeah, so I came to Chicago to do a PhD in disability studies. And Chicago has a wonderfully vibrant disability activist community and community of disabled artists. And so I was sort of initiated into this already vibrant, already sort of in place infrastructure of politicized and engaged disabled people. And when I started studying, I began working with Dr. Carrie Sandall, who is now my colleague at UIC, who's a theater professor and disabilities studies scholar. And we were working, she was teaching a course on disability in American film, and I was her teaching assistant.
Wow.
Um, and simultaneously, the other two people who we ended up working with on Code of the Freaks, Salome Chasnoff, who's a documentary filmmaker and activist in Chicago, and disabled playwright and novelist Susan Nussbaum, were sort of doing these series of community screenings of Hollywood clips for disabled people to kind of just respond to and talk back to. And people wanted to have that conversation, right?
Yeah.
When you are a disabled person and you're used to seeing so many of these representations in film over and over and over again, there's something really powerful about getting in a room with other disabled people to talk about them. And so Carrie and I sort of got together with Susan and Salome and decided there's something here. There's something in the space between the sort of academic tracing of these images and the impact they have on people and the community response to those images. And so we embarked on what was an 11-year project of making Code of the Freaks, which is real Crip Time movie production, I guess. uh, but, you know, that was really my entry point into this. I was, like many people, sort of an avid fan of film and television, right? Like, I
Hmm.
love stories and I love the logic of how stories unfold and the ways that you can read them in so many complex and multiple ways, right? There's this kind of like what the film is telling you, but then there's so many, especially as a queer person, like there's so many ways to read a film or a show or a relationship kind of in more complex ways, or to queer it in interesting ways. And so I found a lot of possibilities in analyzing film. And through, I don't know how many conversations sitting in Susan's living room, we sort of hashed out the types of films we were seeing and what it meant to put them all together and sort of layer them on top of each other, and what kind of story we could tell about the stories films are telling about disability.
Right.
Yeah, so Code of the Freaks is a feature-length documentary film that traces representations of disability across Hollywood cinema, from sort of early filmmaking to more contemporary films. We look at some of the most common tropes that you see across that imagery and feature disabled artists, activists, and scholars talking back to those images. And I think for us, you know, part of the work or part of the interest is in exposing what films themselves are showing, but it was also about using films as a way to tell a much larger story about how society views and understands and relates to disability and disabled people.
Yes. And the one thing, so Code of the Freaks, that's the documentary, and the one thing I really appreciated is that it showed like the history of it, of how far back things go with how, like you said, how people view those who have disabilities. And it's just like, oh my goodness, I can remember reading um, To Kill a Mockingbird in high school
Yeah,
and reading it and saying like, oh wait, that guy, he probably has, a disability. He has, yeah, wow.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
to, know that it was made into a film, and just other films from, back in that time, where it's just like, wow, like they really, uh, showed people with disabilities in a certain way. So I really appreciated that it, it went on to show like it's not just a recent thing. Like it really,
yeah.
goes back in
It's
time.
not just a recent thing. It's not just one film or even one type of representation.
Right.
I mean, one thing I was surprised to learn was that actually one of the very first films, Thomas Edison's 1898 film was called The Fake Beggar, I believe was the name of it. But it's like a 13-second film about somebody faking disability and being caught. So in some ways, disability is literally encoded in the origins of film.
Wow.
Uh, it's that deep in its history.
Wow. Yeah, some of the which is what our conversation will be primarily about, some of the themes that uh were discussed in the film that I found interesting, that really grabbed my attention, and I think um things that I was aware of that I noticed at the time, but then the way the themes really showed up in multiple movies is something that I don't think
Yeah.
I really related to, until seeing them all put together. And it's like, oh yeah, that is the same storyline. That is the same thing that kind of happened in that other in that other movie. So I really appreciated the way that you all were able to string those stories together and show the similarities between the way that the way the stories were told. Um, One of the things that I did want to talk about is that was mentioned in Movie Code of the Freaks is the danger of movies being used to show what all disabilities are like. The example that was given in the movie is Rain Man. So the main
Yeah.
character there has autism, and I can remember growing up in the 80s and early 90s and people saying, oh, like referring to autism as like, oh, you're like Rain Man. And it's like, no, that's not what it's, it's not like that for
Yeah.
everyone. So, can you talk about that and how that can be a dangerous thing for movies to, kind of show like a blanket way of people having disabilities?
Yeah. I mean, Rain Man is such an interesting example too, because, sometimes when we talk about the ways that films work on our, like, within our cultural imagination, will say things like, well, it's just a film. Everybody knows films aren't real life. And I mean, there's a couple of reasons why I wish it were that simple. The
Yeah.
I'll never forget one of my first teaching experiences. I was talking about kind of some of the dominant themes of disability in representation, and a student in my class, uh, she was a master's student, and she had done a special education training, and she said, "Oh yeah, uh, I watched Rain Man as part of my special education training, so I could learn what autistic people are like." And it was such a concrete example of how films are teaching tools, like
Mhm.
both explicitly used in the classroom, but also kind of less explicitly in our cultural imagination, because if we don't have a counter to that, right? If we don't have experience with autistic people in our lives, we don't know that those images are narrative fabrications, or they are caricatures, or they're used to tell, devices used to tell a particular kind of story. And they come to hold this kind of, I don't know, cemented image in our minds. And I think Lawrence Carter Long, who's a disabled activist and actor who we interview in Code of the Freaks, talks about how films like to repeat themselves. It's sort of part of how they work. And so once you have one representation that becomes kind of iconic, that becomes the measure against which other representations have to meet that standard to seem authentic, right? Like,
Right.
oh, well, that's not really authentic. Authentic autism, and I'm using sort of scare quotes because you can't see me,
Yes.
uh, is Rain Man. And so that the danger of that, I mean, danger is a really complicated word, right? But
Hmm.
uh, it it manifests in so many both explicit and implicit ways to shape how the world interacts with autistic people. From expectations that autistic people are supposed to be geniuses or magical, or childlike, all of those images that get sort of concretized or made into this kind of cemented character of Rain Man are at work in everyday interactions that people who don't know any better have with autistic people.
Right.
And we can say the same thing about other representations or other types of disability, right? Like blindness is another kind of iconic disability representation that gets sort of, that shapes how the world interacts with blind people.
Right.
Or, and in some ways you can almost put any disability type in that sentence, and we can think of films that shape how the public views what those disability experiences are like.
Right. Yeah, it's so true that you can definitely fill in the blank for with any disability, and it really does shape the way that society views us as people with disabilities. And I liked what you said where um, where people look to certain films like Rain Man and say like, oh no, this other film is not accurate because it doesn't, he's not like the guy that played that great role in that other movie. So and it's so important that we're talking about this because it is film, but then it's also real life. Because I've run into a situation in many times where I tell people I have spina bifida, and it's just like, oh, well, I know somebody who has spina bifida, and they don't use crutches, and
Yeah.
or I know somebody that has spina bifida, and they, they're really skinny. And it's just like, well, everybody is different.
Yeah.
Literally,
But
everybody
there's
is
no
different.
but yeah, there's no space for that
Right.
complexity, that difference, that multitude, because of the singular way that we think this is that disability,
Right.
right?
Yeah, that's it. That's all.
It becomes, yeah, that's all, period, right?
Yeah.
It just becomes so singular and defining that, I mean, a lack of representation comes with its own problems,
Hmm.
right? To sort of say, well, there's no visibility, people don't understand what a particular type of disability is or looks like. But there's some really interesting kind of theoretical arguments that say there's a lot of power in not having your representation because you get to define it.
Hmm.
There are some schools of thought that really see that as there's lots of harms that come with a lack of visibility and a lack of representation, but it's also, there are equal number of harms that come from this singular type of representation,
Right.
right? And so it it's why we need to talk about them both, right? We need to talk about what it means to, for instance, have very little representation of like EDS in film or television, uh, but also what then comes from a lack of that representation is people are saying, well, what is that? And then you as a person get to say, well, here's what it is, here's what it means to me. And
Hmm.
right, so you're starting not from a concrete image that somebody has of what your disability experience is. You get to fill in the blank
Right.
as opposed to have to rewrite a cultural script that film or television or radio or whatever it is shapes for you.
Yeah, that is, and that's so true and so important because it it's like you give them a real life example of what like you said, EDS, or for spina bifida for me, it's just what it what it is for me, and what it is for me is not what it is for everybody. So it
Yeah.
can look like many different things for every person you meet with that diagnosis. It can look totally different. So that's really really important to share that. And another thing that I noticed and I wanted to touch on too was the villains in the movies are often with disabilities, and they have some type of disability, and it often comes in the form of being disfigured in some kind of way. And I know recently, it's within the last year, the movie Witches that came out, and the witches had limb differences, and that was a really big conversation, and really upsetting for people with limb differences, because it's, I tell the story of how and why I started Our View, and it's because my nephew, his classmates were staring at me one day when I picked him up from school, and it made me think recently about like movies like Witches. So if you're a child and you see a movie
Yeah.
like Witches where somebody has a limb difference, when you're out at the mall or out at Target or wherever with your mom and dad and you see somebody in real life with a limb difference, as a child, you will most likely automatically relate that to the movie you saw. And
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
not, yeah, that's not cool. That's not,
Yeah.
without a further explanation about why they may have the limb difference in the movie, which, nobody wants to talk about that part, but it
Yeah.
would be very helpful because, for me, I didn't pay attention to the kids staring at me if I was using my crutches or my wheelchair, but my nephew paid attention to it and he got really upset by
Yeah.
it. So it's really important that, when people are making these films, that they really pay attention to those types of things, that especially something like a limb difference is something that you can um, experience in real life. I think of
Yeah.
the Captain Hook from Peter Pan, and it's just like if you have, and if a child sees someone with a prosthetic arm, which looks nothing like a hook, obviously, but they might relate it to to that story
Yeah.
and become very afraid. So it's really important that we try to work on uh, incorporating these types of disabilities into stories, but in different ways,
In different ways.
and less
Yeah.
negative ways, I would say. In a more positive way of what what people are able to do, even though they have a limb difference, for example, and rather.
Yeah. I mean, I think, whether we want them to or not, films teach us things.
Right.
And it's such a clearly it, for children that is even deeper and more important. But it works in all types of films, right? I mean, the one thing I am excited by is the fact that there was an actual conversation about that film in a way that I think even Anne Hathaway responded
She did.
to the critique, right?
Hmm.
But the use of physical differences, disabilities, quote unquote deformities, facial scarring as a sign of villainy is, also has a long history in film. Uh, Disability studies scholars David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder sort of talk about this as a material metaphor,
Hmm.
like a way to give flesh to something that's difficult to see, right? So we know that villains are villains because we can see that there's something wrong with them, and that something wrong is, often sort of internal, their villainy, their bitterness, whatever it is, right?
Hmm.
But it has over time become the shorthand in film or in the visual medium to sort of signify that character flaw that gets represented visually,
Right. Wow.
which is also like one of the things that, like, when you sort of think about it, confuses me on some level,
Huh.
is that disability has so many, like, there's so many things that are signified simultaneously, right? Like disability at once signals sort of innocence and purity, and then at the same time, villainy and bitterness, right? Like it can have so many
Right.
coded meanings.
Yeah.
And yet we suddenly, like when we see it, we know which one of those things are being signaled.
Right.
And sometimes it's about the type of impairment or
Hmm.
disability, and sometimes it's about the narrative that it sort of is situated in. But in making Code of the Freaks, I think when we started to watch these films over and over and over again, they they sort of blend in one another. But they also create this kind of confusion that's like is it really all the same
Hmm.
in different variations? Like the disability is not actually about the disabled character, person, or disability. It's always about something else.
Right.
And in some way, that's what we were kind of trying to recreate that experience that we all went through when we were like, I've watched 200 films representing disabled people and I can't tell them apart, even though they're so different and they're depicting different things, because on some level, they're always about stories inspiring either us as viewers or other characters in the film to like be better people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's violent.
Right.
Like, I mean, on some level, like we talk about like, oh, inspiration is it's so tired and it's so disgusting because we don't always want to be inspirational all the time, but it's also like really violent
Mm-hmm.
for disabled people because it means we actually have very little say
Right.
in how people see us or how we relate to the world. And I think that's why it's so important to remake those stories to like track the harm that they do and open up space for new conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is that yeah, I never thought of it in that way that um of it being like you said violent just it's really wow. Yeah, that's a whole new perspective. I really never thought of it that way, but that's really so true. And then the I love what you said too about the way that disability shows up. It's just like it's kind of like okay, which one do you want us to be? Do you want us to be the do you want us to be
Yeah,
the villain or do you want us to be the oh my goodness, it's so pure and innocent or like which one do you want?
yeah, yeah.
So
And
it's
the fact that you can kind of slot these representations into
yeah,
such clear
yep.
caricatures.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's clear categories where it's just like they fit like right into the slot there for sure.
You know, and when it doesn't, you often get the like, well, it's not, I don't see you as disabled, right? Like if you don't fit into those categories, then you get the opposite, with, or the sort of total erasure of the disability. Like,
Right.
oh, well, they're not really disabled because they don't fit in these
Hmm.
things.
Wow, that's so true. So true. Which actually it kind of leads into the next topic, which is disability and race on film. So, for those of you listening and not watching the YouTube version, I am African American. So, those are the types of things I really pay attention to when I watch a movie of how African American men, men of color, are depicted in film when they have a disability. And two really good examples that were mentioned in the film in the Code of the Freaks is the movie Radio and The Soloist. So with Radio, which was one of those classic films that everybody usually loves, and that it was mentioned in Code of the Freaks where it was radio was there for a purpose of to teach the town of the white community of how racist they are, and also at the same time because he had a disability, he still had to be like looked after and watched and monitored. I think is how it was described in the documentary.
Yeah.
And then with the soloist with Jamie Foxx, where the white non-disabled character comes to save him as the disabled black character. So it's something that I've had a discussion with someone. David, he was a guest on my podcast a few months ago, and we talked about it as being African American men in the world today, and in the real world, in society, and in our communities, of how we are perceived as being less threatening because we are wheelchair
Yeah.
users, and we are more accepted possibly in places where other African Americans may not be as accepted openly, because we're seen as being less threatening, because of our disabilities. And I think that's something that really, with the two examples I just mentioned, that's something that's really shown on film as well. And I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, shown and reiterated, right?
Hmm.
And I think for those also who, I should say that I'm also a white academic speaking about this, and I have learned so much from the disabled people of color whose voices are in Code of the Freaks that are have sort of helped educate me about how these images have impacted their lives and the way that they interact in the world. And I think it was Sahai in the film who sort of talks about these depictions sort of alongside like the magical Negro,
Hmm.
right? Like depiction of that kind of cultural figure that gets wrapped into the kind of neutered, like disability comes to desexualize.
Right.
And so much of this sort of kind of cultural fear around men of color are about this sort of have been coded historically through that like sexualized violence, right? And all of the really complicated and again to talk about violence, like the violence that is done through the depiction of images like Radio or The Soloist, or and this was particularly relevant in kind of post World War II films
Hmm.
where like questions of like integration and segregation and sort of all of the anxieties around what it means for disabled veterans were sort of all circulating around the same time. And there was a slew of films that use the disabled Black man as a quote unquote safe cultural figure to teach disabled white people about their own racism, to tell stories of happy integration
Hmm.
in a way that, however, concretize those images as, I don't know, culturally palatable in some ways, that, of course, just perpetuate the kind of white supremacy that's built into the film industry in general, in the ways that I would say the shaping of images of disability in general are often crafted as white, right?
Hmm.
Like, so we can't talk about images of Black disabled men in film in the way that you're talking about without also saying that the images of disabled men are sort of concretized in our national imagery as white disabled men, which is part of what allows the the sort of narrative of Rain Man and Radio to work in the way that it sort of says, oh yeah, well, this intellectually disabled man in Radio is here to tell the town, to teach the town, not himself, but through the white character who
Hmm.
narrates the lessons that he has to bring, right? Like it's all sort of wrapped up in the this sort of exceptional nature of some of these images and the work that they do.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I really just I enjoyed the your movie so much just because it really brought things to my attention again. Like I think I maybe subconsciously realized it and thought
Yeah,
about it, and then seeing it actually played out in front of me on
yeah.
on my screen, it was just like, whoa, like wow, this is really this really does happen.
Well, and like I think TJ in the film talks about how like Radio is followed and managed in every course of
Right.
his life throughout the film, and and the sort of the happy ending feeling that we're meant to get at the end of the film when like Radio stays in high school
Hmm.
and sort of coaches like that's the horizon of his life,
Right.
Like that's meant to be like the best case scenario. Oh, look, he's never, I think Carrie says this too, like he's never allowed to grow, he's never allowed to leave, and he's contained
Right.
in the structure of the high school
Yeah, where he
is
reaches a certain they reach a certain point and that's like you said, that's seemed to
yeah,
be the, okay, like he did it, he achieved this and
yeah.
that's it. Which is so
Well, and
again, so not good.
not good.
Not good. It's
Well,
just not good.
you know, but like one of the things we were sort of also trying to uncover in looking at the kind of history of film is also like where other people of color are, where other disabled people of color are, what other representations of disabled people of color, women of color with disabilities
Hmm.
are. And it's also telling the lack of kind of iconic examples of other people of color in films. So you have like the mad black woman trope,
Hmm.
but it's not often coded as disabled. And that's sort of an interesting thing to unpack that we didn't really get to sort of explore in the film. But this is a case where erasure, I think, creates less of an opportunity and more of a kind of presumption of there are no black disabled women. Like I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know, like what sort of message does this send about who gets to be disabled in our cultural imaginary, I guess.
Yeah,
And it's hard to talk about what isn't there,
when it's not
right?
there.
Like um but this is an instance where you sort of say like, okay, well, what harm is done by not creating a cultural imaginary or creating one that is doesn't read as disabled.
Yeah, that's again, that's something that I never, I think it's a thing of where for me I'll say it's like I always look for myself in a
Yeah.
film so that I don't notice all the time where like, wow, can you think of a film where there is a disabled black woman in it? And it's just like, if you can, it's like very, very few. It'll take you a long time
Yeah.
to really find it. So, so yeah, wow. I'm so happy we're having this conversation. This really has me interested in, in other topics now. So I'm really really excited about this. Thank you.
are are there films that we didn't talk about in the film, like that you are like, oh, this is I'm sorry, I shouldn't, you're asking the questions,
No, you're
but
fine. You're
uh
fine. You're fine.
but like is I mean, especially thinking about kind of representations that you're looking for yourself in, like were there images that were either like particularly harmful that you're like, yeah, that's supposed to be me, but it's not,
The one
or
thing,
images that you're like, this is awesome?
yeah, the one thing that I can always say, which has been a more recent topic of conversation, is the fact that non-disabled people are playing disabled people in movies, and I have a friend who actually she served as I don't know the correct term, but she served as like a consultant, I guess would be the right word, for the show Superstore that was on
Mm-hmm.
NBC for that the character there that uses as a wheelchair user. And he apparently told them that he would only take that job. He's a non-disabled person, so he said he would only take that job if they had someone who was actually a wheelchair user consult on the show. So I think those types of things are really really needed. Like if you're not going to give the job to someone who has a disability, at least have someone either who has that disability or can relate in some way to share true authentic knowledge
Yeah.
about the disability. So that I think that's a big thing for me that really it bothers me a lot, because
Yeah.
they're, and I get it. Many things can be said. Like, it's expensive to live in New York and LA, where most things are, made and all that kind of stuff. So you have the people that have disabilities that are have the limited income and things like that to support themselves to live in those big cities. And, so that's why they don't try out and audition for things. I'm sure there are many reasons
Yeah.
why people with disabilities are not
I
often
mean,
chosen, but
well, even the training programs, like the inaccessibility of like professionalized actor training programs or
hmm
schooling, the inaccessibility of theaters, even if there are training programs. Like, I mean, we can sort of unpack all of the layers and all of the barriers, right,
right.
to access to roles. Um, there's what's really interesting though in this in what you're the story you told is that like the authenticity doesn't only have to come from the actor,
hmm
right? And I think this is one of the things about the conversation around disabled actors playing disabled characters that, and this is unpopular opinion
hmm
in some ways, that I'm like, it doesn't matter for the representation for
hmm
me.
hmm
It matters for the access for disabled actors. That's why it matters,
hmm
right? Because their parts are limited. So I want to be clear, it matters,
Right.
but right, deeply and in important ways, it absolutely matters. But the actor often doesn't have a whole lot of say in the story,
hmm
right? And so the the person might be a disabled person, but the narrative that's being told can still be incredibly damaging and incredibly inauthentic.
hmm
That, and for me, we have to sort of like separate those two things,
Right. Yeah.
or I would argue we have to separate those two things, because to say disabled actors playing disabled characters will create more authentic roles, maybe, I hope so, but if lots of other things happen. And so like this in particular, this piece of hiring a consultant to help make sure the portrayal is accurate is about the physicality of the performance. Sure, that of course is part
hmm
of how that authenticity might get translated, but it's also about the story and making sure it's not participating in these larger narratives. And that is about a collective of disabled people saying, these are our experiences, these are the harms the stories do. So we need both of those things, I guess,
Yes.
is
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that for sure. And um, you're really good with the segues because it just it leads to our next our next
I
topic.
don't know that my students would agree with you. They would call it tangents, but I appreciate that.
No, I appreciate it because I think it does go it goes beyond that individual, that character, and it goes, which is our next topic of the interabled relationships that are told in these stories. So it
Yeah.
really, I always tell people, like, my life is not always the rainbows and butterflies and,
It's not.
everything's great and I'm always happy. Like, no, I could be a pain in the ass sometimes. And if I'm not feeling
and
well,
and disabled people get to be pains in asses too.
yes, and it's just like everybody else. And so you have, and I wanted to talk about it in like the form of relationship wise, like a disabled person in a relationship, a romantic relationship, but in any relationship, friendships and
Yeah.
familial relationships, it's like, no, sometimes you argue with people and sometimes you don't have a
Yeah.
good day and you snap at people just like everybody else. But you don't often see those types of things in movies. It's
Yeah.
the disabled person doesn't really have a say and they're or they always need help and things like that, and the person is in their life to help them and to make their life easier and better, and yeah, sometimes people do come into your life to help you and all of that. And then other times, for a large part of my life, it was like, okay, we will help you if you need it. However,
Yeah.
do what you can first because we're not always going to be here.
Yeah.
You'll be in the house by yourself sometimes, so you will have to get things on your own and figure it out. And we'll help organize some things in a way that will help you, but we're not doing every little thing for you. So I think, um, again, it does go beyond that one character who has the disability and the people that are in the story with them, in the film with them, for them to be authentic as well, and show the frustration. And I interviewed. We talked about acting. I interviewed Ali Stroker a few months ago, and I've become
It's
friends with her.
wonderful.
Yes, yeah, I've
Big
become
fan.
friends with her, and she's really great. And she recently wrote a book. And in her book, she talks about it's a teenage girl who wants to try out for a play, which happens to be Wicked. And I love her story because it really tells things from her perspective as the main character's perspective, but then it also tells it gets into the to the minds of her parents and where her mom and
Mm,
where her parents are kind of like hesitant, like, oh no, like you should do this instead and you shouldn't stick to this kind of stuff. And it's like those are real conversations that parents have with their kids. So I really think
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
a true, a really good representation of what really happens in, you have the child who has a disability that's like, yes, I'm going out for this play and I don't care if, the main character
Yeah.
has to fly on a harness and everything. And, I'm just going to try out. I'm
I will
going to
figure it out. Yeah.
Right. I'm going to figure it out and I'm going to try out for this and I'm going to get the part. And the parent is like, well, maybe you should stick to doing this instead. I think it's like wheelchair racing or something that she does in the book. It's like, you should stick with this and people who are like you. Um, so it's like those types of authentic stories
Yeah.
where it's like, you come up with these conflicts with your own family and your friends about certain things. I think those are I think that goes into a big thing of telling an authentic story as well. The characters who surround that main character.
Yeah. I mean, I think, disability is like inherently relational.
Hmm.
It it's lived in relation. It's really lived in relationship to the world around us, like whether it's the built environment, right, where we sort of talk about how the environment itself can disable or enable us, but it's also lived in relation to the people in our lives, to institutions in our lives. And I think so many of the stories that we tell so many of the stories that we tell about disability only posit one kind of relationship, which is deficit oriented, right?
Hmm.
Disability negatively impacts our relationship to parents, potential love interests, partners, the world around us. And so the stories that unfold about those relationships are only ever negative ones.
Hmm.
Or the relationship helps remove the negative aspects of disability, right? This sort of like
Right.
love cures narratives,
Yes.
but right. um, but like all forms of relationships, like when you really start to get at the messiness of it, there's so many more complex stories that we can tell,
Hmm.
but we have to remove this sort of deficit or negative view of disability to allow that complexity to come forward, I think. And I think that's part of what narratives, whether they're written or film narratives, miss is that the messiness, that the overlapping nature of the joys and the heartache and the shit and
Hmm.
the ways that, sometimes, yeah, like my partner's like, it's just too much. And then, but most of the time, it's like, how do we figure this out together? And what kind of intimacy is born from living in relationship to whatever my body needs or what her body needs or what our minds need or what her minds, right? Like
Hmm.
that's the stuff of relationships. And I think that's so much more interesting.
Yes, it is. It is. It really, it truly is so much more interesting. And it's so much, it's real. It's real life. And, the challenges, every relationship you have has its challenges and its ups and downs. And, um, to really show that, I think would be very beneficial to so many. Can you share with us what is something that you would tell filmmakers, writers, producers, anyone who is in the film industry, something that you would tell them that would help them make their films more authentic and inclusive of those who have disabilities?
Yeah. You asked me this question and I thought a lot about like, can I offer a really pithy and sort of like easy to do. Uh, so I'm gonna try.
Okay.
Uh, I mean, authenticity is so complicated because
Hmm.
it's not one thing, right? And so I think that's starting point one is recognizing that what is authentic is not singular, right? I mean, we talked about the harm of the single narrative, right? Like disability is only Rain Man. So the first step might be to say authenticities, or like, I don't know how you make plural authenticity, but like it's there are multiple ways to represent something in a way that resonates with somebody's lived experience. And to remove the idea that there's one right or that one representation is going to get it right, that's starting point one, I think, for me. And I think the second piece is that we think of inclusion as a yes or no question, right? Like either it's there or it's not there. But to me, the question is different. The question is it meaningful? How is it meaningful? Right? Is it substantive? And how is it substantive? And the industry doesn't get to be the one that determines what is meaningful and what is substantive. The community does, and the communities do. So, right, you can't sort of the industry can't pat themselves on the back and say, we got it right, good for us, we've hit inclusion. It's an ongoing conversation. And recognizing that it's the multiplicities of communities that get to say, this is meaningful, this is substantive, that sort of get to set the measuring bar.
Hmm.
And I think the third piece is that inclusion often feels like you get to come to our table, right? Like we'll include you in our table. But letting disabled people set the table, design the table, so to speak, if we're going to really kill the metaphor, you end up with a much more interesting table. And so, like, and that's worth, like that's a new genre, like that's, or that those are stories that have never been told. And like, to me, that is what's so exciting about what we could be doing. I think like there's so much amazing work coming out of disability art and culture, like new forms of movement being birthed by disabled bodies, right? New poetry being put out into the world by disabled minds and bodies. And when we make space for that, we can show the world things that it hasn't seen yet. And I think that, I don't know, maybe that's not inclusion, maybe that's something else. But like whenever I give talks about Code of the Freaks, people always ask like, what do I want to see? And I sort of have come to the point of saying, I don't know what I want to see, and that's what's most exciting to me. Like what happens when you give disabled people the tools to write the script, give them all the material, like accessible equipment to make the movie, tell the story, act on the other side of the camera. I want to see that. And I should give a shout out to Best Summer Ever movie, because it's one of the closest that I've seen to representing disability community on screen.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's a majority disabled cast and crew. I mean, it plays with genre in a way that reproduces a lot of the sort of like narratives that you find in high school musicals and sort of summer camp films, but it does something different. And I think what's so cool is like trying to put your finger on what's different. Is disabled people were involved at every stage, and so it looks different, it feels different. It felt like disabled community spaces that I've been in. It sort of felt like home in some way, which is really cool to watch.
Yeah, I have not watched it yet, but I did hear about it. Actually, my mom told me about it. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And again, thank you for your time today. I really enjoyed this conversation. And before we do conclude this conversation, can you tell everyone where they can find Code of the Freaks, which I highly recommend everybody watch this film. You will definitely learn some things from it.
Thank you. Yeah. So our distributors, Kino Lorber, have information about the multiple ways that you can purchase the film. Mm-hmm. It's available for rent on Amazon, iTunes, Google Play, and other streaming services that are escaping me at this moment in time. On Canopy, for those of you that have a Canopy account, you can also access it. Anybody listening outside of the US, Reservoir Docs is our distributor outside of the US. And so they are constantly updating their website with information about where the film is available, screenings, and hopefully it will be on streaming services outside of the US soon as well.
Yes. Well, Allie, I thank you for your time today and the information and knowledge you have shared with our listeners. Again, I encourage everybody to purchase the film Code of the Freaks and start conversations about it and talk about it and share with us on our social media accounts that you've watched it and what you learned from it. That is, let us continue this conversation for sure.
Well, and we do hope, we made the film to be a conversation starter, not the end piece, right? And so we know there's so many more films we didn't get to talk about, and new films and new representations that are coming out, daily in many cases. So it's also been really lovely for us to see what people think of new films coming out and or films that we didn't get to talk about. So.
Yeah. Well, again, I thank you for this conversation, and I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to staying in touch with you and hopefully being able to collaborate on something and work together again in the future. Yes.
I'd love that.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your night there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Our View podcast. Leave us a review wherever you listen and let us know what you liked about this episode. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to follow us on all social media platforms for more disability-related content at Our View for Life. That's OURVIEW, the number 4, LIFE. If you listen to this episode on your phone, take a screenshot and post it to your Instagram or Facebook stories and be sure to tag us. We thank you for listening and take care.